Imagine a country sitting on a treasure trove so vast it could power the world for decades. Oil fields stretching as far as the eye can see, gas reserves that rival the biggest in the world, and a coastline that hugs some of the busiest trade routes on the planet. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am your speaker host, Serhi. Picture a nation perfectly positioned to bridge the markets of Europe with the booming economies of Asia, with a population of over 80 million people, many of whom are highly educated, ready to drive innovation and growth. This is Iran, a country that on paper has everything it needs to be an economic juggernaut, a regional leader, a global force, yet something's gone terribly wrong. Despite all this potential, Iran's economy is teetering, plagued by blackouts, a currency that's worth less than the paper it's printed on, and a population struggling to afford basics like bread and fuel. How does a nation with so much going for it end up in such a precarious spot? Today, we're diving deep into Iran's economic story, why it hasn't completely collapsed, what's holding it back, and whether there's any hope for a brighter future. This is a tale of untapped riches, geopolitical chess games, and tough choices. So let's get started. Let's paint a picture of Iran's strengths because they're nothing short of remarkable. Iran sits on the third largest oil reserves in the world, trailing only Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. We're talking about 158 billion barrels of crude oil, enough to keep pumps running for generations. On top of that, it has the second largest natural gas reserves, just behind Russia, with 33 trillion cubic meters of gas waiting to be tapped. These aren't just big numbers, they're a lifeline. Unlike oil fields in the Arctic or shale deposits that require expensive high-tech extraction, Iran's resources are relatively easy to access, sitting in fields that have been producing for decades. Add to this Iran's geography, which is practically a gift from the gods of trade. Its long coastline along the Persian Gulf puts it right next to the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point through which a fifth of the world's oil passes. Tankers loaded with crude sail past Iran's shores every day, heading to Europe, Asia, and beyond. Iran is also geographically at the center of the world's population, equidistant from the economic hubs of Europe and the fast-growing markets of Asia, like China and India. This makes it a natural hub for trade, a crossroads where goods, ideas, and wealth could flow. Then there's Iran's people, over 80 million strong, with a workforce that's surprisingly well educated for a country facing so many challenges. Iran's universities churn out engineers, doctors, scientists, and IT specialists at a rate that rivals many developed nations. Unlike some resource-rich countries where education lags, Iran has invested heavily in schools and universities since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, creating a pool of talent that could drive a modern economy. Imagine a country with this much oil, this prime location, and this kind of human capital. It sounds like a recipe for prosperity, right? You'd expect Iran to be like its neighbors across the Persian Gulf, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, or even Saudi Arabia. These countries have turned their oil wealth into skyscrapers, luxury resorts, and infrastructure that dazzles the world. Their GDP per capita, a measure of average income, is 10 times higher than Iran's, $60,000 or more compared to Iran's measly $6,000. Sure, those countries have their own issues, labor rights controversies, over-reliance on oil, political tensions, but they've got the cash to paper over those cracks. Iran, with all its potential, should be in the same league. So why isn't it? The answer lies in a toxic mix of external pressures and self-inflicted wounds. Let's start with the biggest external factor: sanctions. For over 45 years, Iran has been under some of the toughest economic restrictions in the world, led mostly by the United States. These aren't just minor trade barriers, they're a full-on economic blockade. If you're a company, an individual, or even another country, trading with Iran outside of very specific exceptions can get you blacklisted from global markets. That means no access to US banks, no use of the SWIFT system for international money transfers, and no dealings with any company that wants to do business in the US. Imagine trying to run a business when you can't wire money, import equipment, or even buy spare parts because suppliers are too scared of US penalties. The video mentions recent US airstrikes on Iran's suspected nuclear facilities, a flashpoint in its ongoing rivalry with the US and Israel, but it's clear these are just the latest in a long saga of conflict. Since the 1979 hostage crisis, when Iranian students seized the US embassy in Tehran, relations have been frosty at best. The US sees Iran as a threat, its nuclear ambitions, its support for groups like Hezbollah, its influence in the Middle East. Sanctions are their tool to keep Iran in check, but they've also kneecapped its economy. Here's how sanctions work in practice. Let's say a German company wants to sell turbines to Iran for its power plants. If they go through with it, they could lose access to US banks, which are critical for global trade. Even if they don't deal directly with the US, their partners, say a British insurer or a Japanese supplier, might, and those partners won't touch them if they're linked to Iran. It's a domino effect, what economists call secondary sanctions. The SWIFT system, which handles most international bank transfers, is US dominated, so getting cut off from it is like being banned from the internet of finance. Even countries that don't care about US markets have to play along because their businesses might deal with someone who does. The result? Iran is forced into a shadow economy, selling its oil through black market channels at massive discounts. Smugglers and middlemen get rich, while Iran gets pennies on the dollar for its most valuable resource. This brings us to Iran's oil, the heart of its economy and its biggest curse. Oil and gas make up about 60% of Iran's export revenue and a huge chunk of its government budget. In a good year, Iran can produce 4 million barrels of oil a day, enough to flood global markets. But sanctions mean it can't sell that oil openly. Instead, it relies on clandestine deals, often with China, its biggest trading partner. China buys Iranian oil at a fraction of the market price, sometimes 20% or 30% less, because Iran has few other buyers. Ships loaded with Iranian crude might turn off their transponders to avoid detection, docking in Chinese ports under the radar. It's a system that keeps Iran's economy afloat, but at a huge cost. The money Iran does make is often siphoned off by corrupt intermediaries or spent on overpriced imports, as suppliers charge a premium to skirt sanctions. It's a lose-lose. Iran's oil wealth, which could fund schools, hospitals, and roads, is instead fueling a black market that benefits everyone but Iranians. But let's not lay all the blame at the feet of sanctions. Iran's leaders have made choices that have deepened the crisis. Take energy infrastructure, for example. With all that oil and gas, you'd think Iran would have power plants humming and lights on 24/7. Instead, blackouts are a fact of life, even in Tehran, the capital. The problem? Iran's electrical grid is falling apart, old, underfunded, and mismanaged. Power plants built in the 1980s are limping along, unable to handle the demand from a population that relies on air conditioning in 100-degree summers and heating in freezing winters. Sanctions make it hard to import modern equipment. Sure, Western companies like Siemens or GE won't touch Iran, but Iran hasn't helped itself. The video points out that global demand for grid components is through the roof thanks to renewable energy transitions, data centers for AI, and even cryptocurrency mining. Suppliers can sell transformers and turbines to Europe or the US at a markup, so why risk dealing with Iran? Iran could turn to China, which has become a master at navigating sanctions. Chinese firms have supplied everything from drones to consumer goods to sanctioned countries, often through shell companies or murky trade networks. Iran could trade its cheap oil for Chinese-made grid equipment, but it hasn't done so effectively. Why? Part of it is politics. China's companies still have to be careful not to get caught violating US sanctions, as they want access to Western markets. But a bigger issue is Iran's own reluctance. The government doesn't seem to prioritize fixing the grid, and here's where we get to one of the biggest self-inflicted wounds: energy subsidies. Iran's leaders have made fuel and electricity so cheap that it's practically free, a policy meant to keep the population happy, but one that's backfired in spectacular ways. Let's break down these subsidies. Gasoline in Iran costs about 70 cents a liter, or $2.65 a gallon, at the official exchange rate. For the first 150 liters per vehicle per month, it's even cheaper, half that price. Sounds like a great deal, right? But Iran's currency, the rial, is in shambles. Decades of sanctions, mismanagement, and inflation have gutted its value. On the black market, where people trade for dollars or euros, the exchange rate is 20 times higher than the official one. That means the real price of gas is closer to 5 cents a liter or 17 cents a gallon, one of the cheapest in the world. Electricity is similarly subsidized, costing households and businesses a fraction of what it's worth. You'd think this would be a blessing, but it's a curse. When energy is basically free, people have no reason to conserve it. Homes run air conditioners all day, factories leave machines humming, and drivers fill up gas tanks without a second thought. The result? Iran uses more energy per person than Denmark, a wealthy country with a modern economy, but produces only a fifth of the economic output. It's one of the least energy-efficient economies on the planet. This inefficiency has spawned some bizarre side effects. Take cryptocurrency mining, for example. Iran's cheap electricity has made it a hotspot for Bitcoin miners who set up massive computer rigs to solve complex algorithms and earn digital currency. Why? Because crypto is a way to bypass sanctions. Bitcoin doesn't need banks or SWIFT. It's a perfect workaround for a country cut off from global finance. But these miners suck up so much electricity that they're blamed for blackouts, especially in summer when demand spikes. The government condemns them, shutting down illegal operations, but the real issue isn't just miners, it's the system that makes energy so cheap that it's ripe for abuse. The video paints a vivid picture. Iran's oil wealth, which could power a modern economy, is being frittered away on inefficient consumption and shady side hustles. Then there's the black market for fuel. With gas so cheap, smugglers have turned it into a gold mine. Picture this. Someone fills up a truck with 44-gallon drums of gasoline, drives it across the border to Iraq or Turkey, and sells it at a 2,000% markup. Even at that price, it's cheaper than what local retailers charge, so buyers snap it up. It's a thriving business, but it's a tragedy for Iran. The country's oil, its most valuable asset, is literally being hauled away in barrels, enriching smugglers and foreign markets while Iran gets crumbs. The video calls this comical if it weren't so sad, and it's hard to disagree. Imagine a family in Tehran struggling to afford food while smugglers make millions selling Iran's subsidized fuel abroad. It's a stark reminder that the system is broken and the people are paying the price. This brings us to another failure: Iran's oil refineries. You'd think a country with so much crude oil would be self-sufficient in gasoline. But until recently, Iran imported much of its fuel because it lacked refining capacity. When sanctions tightened around 2010, cutting off imports, Iran rushed to build its own refineries. Problem solved, right? Not quite. These refineries are shoddy, built with outdated technology and hampered by corruption. The gasoline they produce is so low quality that it damages car engines and blankets cities like Tehran in toxic smog. Respiratory illnesses are rampant and drivers face constant repair bills. Iran now supplies its domestic market and even exports to allies like Syria or Venezuela, but at what cost? The air pollution is so bad that schools sometimes close and hospitals are overwhelmed. The video describes this as a Faustian bargain, cheap fuel to placate the masses, but a system that poisons the air and breaks down cars. It's a short-term fix for a long-term disaster. Let's zoom out to the bigger economic picture. Iran's reliance on oil isn't just a problem because of sanctions. It's a classic case of the resource curse. Countries that depend on a single commodity, like oil, often struggle to diversify. When oil prices are high, the money rolls in, and there's no urgency to build other industries. When prices crash or sanctions block sales, the economy tanks. Iran's GDP growth has been erratic, swinging with oil markets and sanction regimes. In the early 2000s, high oil prices brought a boom, but since then, sanctions and mismanagement have kept growth stagnant. The video compares Iran to its Gulf neighbors, who've used oil wealth to diversify. Think Dubai's tourism or Qatar's media empire. Iran, by contrast, has doubled down on oil, with little to show for it. Non-oil sectors like manufacturing or tech are underdeveloped, starved of investment and innovation. Why hasn't Iran fixed this? The leadership is a big part of the problem. Iran's government is a unique blend of theocracy, private industry, and state control, run by aging clerics and bureaucrats who prioritize stability over reform. Subsidies, like cheap fuel, are a way to keep the population quiet, but they're a ticking time bomb. When the government tried to cut fuel subsidies in 2019, protests erupted across the country, some of the worst since the 1979 revolution. Hundreds were killed, thousands arrested. The leaders backed off, afraid of losing their grip on power. Concessions to the West, say, scaling back the nuclear program, would be seen as weakness by hardline groups within Iran, who wield significant influence. Concessions to their own people, like ending subsidies or opening up the economy, risk more unrest. The video doesn't delve into politics, but hints at a deeper dive on a second channel, suggesting the system is rigged against change. Is there a way out? The video suggests two paths other oil-rich countries have taken. One is diversification, using oil money to build new industries, like the UAE's tourism or Saudi Arabia's push into tech. Iran could invest in manufacturing, IT, or agriculture, leveraging its educated workforce. The other is creating a sovereign wealth fund like Norway, which invests oil revenue globally to secure long-term wealth. Both require bold reforms, cutting subsidies, modernizing infrastructure, and opening up to the world. But Iran's leaders seem paralyzed. Diversifying means loosening control, which they fear could spark dissent. Investing abroad requires trust in global markets, tough for a country treated as a pariah. The status quo, cheap fuel, black market trade, defiance of the West, suits the leadership, China, and even some OPEC members, but it's a dead end for ordinary Iranians. Let's talk about those Iranians because they're the heart of this story. Picture a young woman named Layla, a chemical engineering graduate from Sharif University, one of Iran's best. She dreams of working on renewable energy, but there are no jobs in her field. Instead, she's waiting tables, earning barely enough to cover rent. Her brother, a doctor, moved to Canada, joining the millions who've left. Their parents, nearing retirement, worry about pensions that won't keep up with inflation. Layla's story isn't unique. It's the story of a generation trapped by an economy that can't deliver. The video doesn't tell Layla's story, but it doesn't have to. The statistics, 12% unemployment, 40% inflation, a birth rate of 1.6, paint a picture of a society under strain. Iran's aging population means fewer workers like Layla will be left to support more retirees, a crisis looming on the horizon. What about the global impact? Iran's struggles don't just affect Iranians. The Middle East is a geopolitical powder keg, and Iran's instability ripples outward. Its cheap oil fuels China's factories, but also funds groups like Hezbollah, raising tensions with Israel and the US. If Iran's economy collapses, it could destabilize the region, disrupting oil supplies and trade routes. Conversely, a thriving Iran could stabilize the Persian Gulf, fostering trade and cooperation. The video doesn't predict the future, but asks us to consider the stakes. Could Iran reintegrate into the global economy? It would require lifting sanctions, which depends on diplomatic breakthroughs unlikely under the current regime. It would also mean domestic reforms, ending subsidies, fighting corruption, investing in infrastructure that risk unrest. The leadership, old and entrenched, sees change as a threat, not an opportunity. Let's reflect on Iran's nuclear ambitions, because they're part of this puzzle. The video questions why a country with so much oil and gas needs nuclear energy. Iran says it's for power generation, but the West fears it's for weapons. With endless fossil fuels, the argument for nuclear power seems shaky, fueling suspicions that keep sanctions in place. If Iran could resolve these concerns, it might open the door to trade, but that's a big if. The leadership uses the nuclear program as a point of pride, a symbol of defiance against the West. Giving it up would mean losing face, something they're loath to do. History offers some lessons. In the 1970s, before the revolution, Iran was a darling of the West, with a modernizing economy under the Shah. Oil money flowed, and Tehran was a cosmopolitan hub. But inequality and repression sparked the 1979 uprising, leading to the Islamic Republic and decades of isolation. The video doesn't dwell on history, but it's a reminder that Iran's potential isn't new. It's been squandered before. The Shah's regime fell because it ignored the people. Today's leaders risk the same by clinging to a failing system. The protests of 2019, sparked by fuel price hikes, show how volatile things are. Another round of unrest could force change, but at what cost? What would it take to turn things around? First, Iran needs to modernize its energy sector. New power plants, better grids, and efficient refineries could harness its oil and gas wealth. This means working with partners like China or Russia, who are less squeamish about sanctions. Second, it needs to diversify. Iran's pistachio exports, for example, are world-class, $1 billion a year, but tiny compared to oil. Investing in tech, agriculture, or tourism could create jobs for people like Layla. Third, it needs to tackle corruption. The video hints at grift and graft in Iran's institutions, where officials siphon off wealth while infrastructure crumbles. Finally, it needs to engage with the world. Sanctions won't lift without compromises, but Iran's leaders see compromise as surrender. Globally, Iran's struggles matter. The Strait of Hormuz, near its shores, is a lifeline for oil markets. If Iran destabilizes, prices could spike, hitting economies from Tokyo to Berlin. Its rivalry with Saudi Arabia and Israel fuels proxy wars, from Yemen to Syria. A stronger Iran could stabilize the region, but a weaker one could spark chaos. The video doesn't predict collapse, but warns that the status quo, black market oil, subsidized fuel, isolated trade, isn't sustainable. China benefits, buying cheap oil. OPEC members like Saudi Arabia gain market share. Iran's leaders stay in power, but the people lose. Could Iran break free? The video leaves it open-ended, but the odds are tough. Reintegration requires trust between Iran and the West, between leaders and citizens. Trust is in short supply. Still, there's hope in Iran's resilience. Its people have endured sanctions, wars, and crises, yet keep going. The question is whether that resilience can translate into reform, or if Iran will remain a land of what-ifs, a country with everything to gain, but too much to overcome. So, what do you think? Can Iran harness its potential, or is it doomed to limp along, a giant hobbled by its own choices and the world's rules? Let's keep this conversation going.